Just had to take a drive up toward the Utica area. Don't know if those of you are familiar with that little road that goes up there, kind of go out through, I don't know, once you get outside of Westonia, things start to get really pretty, but really funky too. Yeah, so I drove up there and drove back. Got a Big Mac bundle for lunch. So I am feeling nationalism, man. I am feeling flags. I'm feeling elections. I'm feeling just McDonald's. I'm ready for nationalism, full up on nationalism, much more than I wanted to get this morning. So anyway, yeah, interesting roads. Okay. I want to start off with this quote that I used in the quiz. And it tripped up more of you than I was hoping it would trip up. Don't worry if it trips you up. I thought it was important to start with it. It's kind of like trying to apply the concepts of guess to a historical situation that you may not have been understanding completely, but I wanted to sort of, I think once we understand what this Massimo, how am I going to pronounce that name? I'm not Italian. Can't pronounce that. Anyway, what we're trying to understand this politician was saying at the time, if we can understand that, we can understand something that I think is crucial to how we got this sense of belonging to a nation. So this was 1861, which is, you know, when we think about Italy, we'd often think about Rome and the Roman Empire and all the way back to, but in the 1850s, so at the time, you know, around the time of the US Civil War, Italy was not politically unified. There were, you know, a number of principalities, a number of regions, a number of villages. It wasn't really linguistically unified. I don't know if you remember when I was talking about how my grandfather was speaking what he called dialect that wasn't really like Italian at all. So it wasn't linguistically unified. It wasn't politically unified. There was a lot of allegiance to, there's still the Catholic Church, and the Rome functioned as basically kind of a governmental structure. There were various ways in which it was connected to other parts of Europe as well. So it wasn't one continuous national field. And this politician and others wanted to make it a nation. And so what he said was, we have made Italy, in the sense that they had achieved, after, you know, various armed conflicts, they had achieved political unification so that they had set up a centralized government. And then he said, now we must make Italians, which is kind of a strange thing to say, right? It's like, we've made this thing called Italy as a political unit, but now we have to start making Italians. So it leads to the question, well, how do you make Italians? How do you make Italians? Well, a lot of people modeled their nation making on what people thought the French were able to do. In a similar way to what happened in Italy, at the time of what we call the French Revolution, there were actually, in what is now the territory of France, what we call French was actually a minority language. So in some ways, it was only after the French Revolution, the establishment of a different kind of national state, that they began to try to make people into French people. One of the crucial ways that we become national is through schooling, through education. It is in our schools that we have, as a guest puts it, we had language standardization, so that whatever you were speaking in your little town or your little community, whether you want to call it an accent or a dialect or some version of something else, or maybe not even the national language, you would standardize it around one, in this case, the dialect that they spoke around the area of Paris. In the Italian case, it was, I believe, a dialect that they spoke around the area of Tuscany. So, you know, you'd standardize the language, and that would be the way in which everyone would be graded and have to learn. And if you spoke anything else, you'd be in trouble. Schools also give us a shared sense of history, that we all have these basic ideas or basic facts that we know that we come from our own, if we think about our own schooling, we learn about the territory of the United States, learn about national independence, learn about all those documents, those kinds of things. It also importantly creates literacy. I mean, I guess we didn't discuss this very much when we were talking about language, but everyone has language, as in spoken language, but literacy, or being able to read and write, is kind of variable among populations. And so, a lot of people are perfectly fine without having literacy. But what schools do is it spreads literacy more widely in the population. And what this does, and this was something that in Benedict Anderson's book, which I gave you an image from, Imagined Communities, he describes as crucial, is it makes possible the reading of a newspaper. And with a newspaper, it becomes, like the shared sense of history, a shared sense of facts. So that, this is kind of weird because I don't know how many of you get newspapers at your house anymore, but in the old days, and especially in the 19th century, it was kind of an innovation that every day you'd get this, sheet of paper. It would show up at your door, and it would be the same for everyone. And it had sort of all these kinds of facts or events put together as if we should all be concerned about these facts. So, for those of you who are looking at the news these days, this is something that people sort of lament, that in some ways television broadcasts or radio broadcasts started to take on that role of newspapers. But now oftentimes our news comes to us through our own feeds, or our own Facebook feed or Twitter feed, or what's that other one? Anyway, when the news alerts pop up, so that you're getting not a shared sense of facts, but kind of a curated sense of facts based on your position. So getting back to this point, though, that this is one way in which people start to feel or imagine that they share a community with others in places where they may not have even met them before. Other ways to build nations. Guest goes on there. The schools was the first thing he mentioned, but then he talks about creating roads and railways. So things that integrate the country so that you can drive or travel and feel like you're in the same place together. I guess that's why my trip to Utica made me feel so nationalist, because I can drive along a road, it's maintained, people are in the same time zone, I can talk to them, it all makes sense. When you have railways, you have a shared sense of time, you have to coordinate your clocks and your schedules, and it brings together what is called a national economy, so that your roads and railways are centered on your own nation. Going to mention a couple other things that Guest doesn't talk about a lot, but a lot of nations, especially there's some interesting stuff that happens in, say, Mexico, where the sense of nation was fostered through an idea of food and this sort of national cookbook, so that you're cooking things from maybe not from your own group, but are seen as sort of national dishes, as things that everyone should be able to do and aspire to, and that the good housewife, and as we'll talk about, nation is always gendered, as the good mother or housewife would be able to cook these kinds of national foods. Things like composing a national anthem, having festivals that we share together, celebrations of independence or Thanksgiving or victory over your rivals, music in general, things that are composed, with a sense of, that you might hear again, being able to share things over, say, a radio transmission. I think that, I remember when I was doing field work in Colombia, I'd be walking along and everyone had the same, there was only one very powerful radio station, and everyone had the same radio station on. So you could almost walk down the road and you'd kind of keep hearing the same song. You'd never miss a beat because there it was with you the whole time, creating the sense that we're all kind of in this together, no matter if we actually meet each other or not. Now, I think it's always extremely important to ask, well, who is going to be included in these songs, in these cookbooks? What kinds of things get elevated to the level of belonging to the nation, and who might get excluded or left out or seen as being not part of the standard, not part of the dialect, not worthy of integration into the national infrastructure, get substandard schooling. So this is something we always want to keep our eye on when it comes to nation building. And I think as I was reading stuff, it reminded me of one of an anthropologist was just brilliant and hugely influential, and has now kind of having difficulty even finding a good picture of her. Brackette Williams in 1989 wrote an article called "A Class Act: Anthropology and the Race to Nation Across Ethnic Terrain." Brilliant stuff. Still don't understand it myself, but I think one of the she had a great sense for titles, right? And one of her huge point was that almost always your idea of nation, the idea of who's included and not, is going to be tied to, especially in the Americas, it's going to be tied to race, and also to class, to social class, and to ethnicity. So some things that we've talked about. So like I said, a great title there, "A Class Act: Anthropology and the Race to Nation Across Ethnic Terrain." Hugely influential article. Truly brilliant anthropologist. Unfortunately, it's not published as much as I want her to, but there she is. And so, as I was saying, we talked about ideas of nation being tied to race, class, ethnicity. What she didn't talk about, but we'll be talking about next week a little bit more, is gender and sexuality. And those are also important in terms of, whether the nation is considered as a fatherland or a motherland, and who's supposed to be cooking for the nation and who's supposed to be, fighting for the nation, etc. Those are often going to be tied to gender and also to ideas about, who's included and what kind of, even in terms of laws and sexuality and ideas about that. We'll be doing that next week, so fun times. Now, one of the things that I think could be one of the best nation builders, a very good thing to build your nation, that didn't really get discussed by guests a little bit here and there. One of you actually brought it up in the comments, and that is the military. And a lot of countries promoted compulsory military service, so that all the boys, all the 18-year-old boys would have to do a year or two of military service. Some countries even made it gender neutral, so men and women would have to do military service compulsory. And whether or not there was necessarily a conflict involved, it has a really interesting effect, is that you would take people from different parts of the country and you'd put them together. And I think this is something that almost everyone who sees a military installation or has served in the military or is I think it's just always very it's very impressive to people. So that if you think about people's experience during World War II, putting people together from the South and North and having them fight alongside each other. If you think about what happened in Italy, so in Italy there was a huge division, still is to a certain extent, between the Southern Italians and the Northern Italians. But in terms of the military, they'd sort of send the Southerners north and the Northerners south. You know, so it tends to integrate people that may not have seen each other before, even if you're not actively fighting anybody. However, if you are actively fighting somebody, it can be even more helpful because it turns your focus away from sort of internal divisions or internal issues that you might have. And you say, well, we're all in this together. We have to fight off the Peruvians or the, you know, and so we all become Ecuadorians because all of a sudden Peru is threatening our national borders. So it helps in some ways because you already have this kind of amalgamated identity, and then you're able to focus that on external enemies. Now, I guess it gives the example of Eritrea, and you know, I think that militarization can be very effective. It can also backfire too. If you end up in a highly militarized society, it can lead to other forms of confrontation and protest. Not all young people like compulsory military service, and so I remember there's some very famous examples of these singers in Argentina who wrote a very famous folk song about being sort of made to do this compulsory military service. It was meant to cause national unity, but you know, it kind of backfires if there's protest against it. In the case of Eritrea, people leaving the country, feeling that they had to leave, and sort of forming this identity outside the country. So this is, you know, like I said, it can be a very effective thing, but there's also some ways in which it can backfire. I want to focus a little bit on nations and nationalism and nation building. Always are. They always make me how to say. I think there's some difference between the ideal or what could be and what often happens in reality. I want to focus on what I think is sort of the traditional notion of nation building, which still holds sway. It's not gone, but things have changed somewhat. And taking Brackette Williams' phrase, across ethnic terrain here, because she wasn't really saying that this was sort of the instantiation of one ethnicity, but it was kind of something that happened across this ethnic terrain. So, I mean, when I think about how national identities are formed, there are times that it really instantiates a specific identity. And so, you know, other groups might get really pissed off if your ethnic group is in charge of the nation, or if your ethnic group is the one whose language is trying to be standardized across the nation. So it can happen, but a lot of times when we think about a nation and national identity, it's kind of, you know, it's more, how to say, it's more diffuse, it's more blended, or they take things from different places. So, you know, let's say a cookbook, we'll take dishes from different parts of the country and sort of put them together and, you know, mix them up. And so you'll get kind of this idea of regionalism, but that we're all kind of in this together. You know, there's sort of some regional identities, but they get blended into the larger nation. So for me, I think it's more, it's not necessarily that it creates an ethnicity, but it creates something that's, you know, it's this idea that Benedict Anderson has of an imagined community. So, you know, it's the idea that even though I don't know people from, you know, I don't know people from California, except for Kellen, or wait, Texas. No, California. Where? Hawaii. Whoa, even further than I thought. Shoot. Okay, so I don't know people except if they come here, but see, here he's come all this way. You know, the infrastructure has brought him here. And so, but I imagine myself that I could share things from all that way far away. Oh, was your roommate first year that was from Texas? Aha, see, I'm not entirely crazy. Okay, just slightly. All right, so it's sort of like an ethnic group, but it's kind of like I said, it's kind of a little more free floating than that. And I think that at least when you think about what happens to people who sort of continue to be, who don't join the nation, then they stay in their ethnic group, and then the nation considers them to be ethnic minorities, that they haven't sort of joined the nation enough. And like I said, this is kind of the traditional idea, and I think it still holds sway in many countries. If you think about, in some ways, what the Chinese state does with so-called ethnic minorities, is probably kind of a very traditional idea that some people are not doing enough to join the nation, and so they're kind of left in the ethnic minority category. So I guess I would say that, I've been struggling with this because, I mean, I do like Guest's definition of nationalism, and a lot of you quoted it. Nationalism emerges when a sense of ethnic community combines with a desire to create and maintain a nation state. And so I guess when I say quibbles, that sounds kind of extremely old-fashioned. I'm not entirely disagreeing. I'm just a little bit puzzled at some of the language use there. Okay, so I'll say that sometimes this works. I mean, so if you think about the Kurds, for example, the Kurds that Guest discussed a little bit, that are, spread across some of the nation states in Iraq, in Syria, in Turkey. You may have heard on the news, when was it, last year? I mean, these have been allies of the United States that we sort of pulled out of northern Syria, and then Turkey wanted to go in because the Kurds are seen kind of as this, I mean, definitely an ethnic group that has at various times wanted its own state or its own, at least, autonomous zone in a place where they've never really had a Kurdish state. So this certainly works for some peoples of the world in which you have this ethnic community already, and you desire to create your own nation state in a certain place. And as some of you noted, nationalism can also be a potent kind of anti-colonial force. So if you're under colonial rule, stirring up this sense of nation, if you're being ruled by somebody from the outside, can be a very potent force in order to overthrow a colonial power or some sort of oppressive force. My problem with the phrasing of this is that I think that nationalism is not, it's that ethnic community part. I think that like I said, I think that when I feel, I don't know about you, but when I feel American, it's not very tightly linked to the same kinds of things that I think about with ethnicity. And so when I think about sort of powerful national identities, they are, I guess I would just say they seem a little bit more free floating. They get revved up in like sporting events and certain kinds of food and certain kinds of television programs, you might say, but it's much more, I guess I feel like it's more blended or diffuse. And I guess I would say that along with that, nationalism can be very often embraced by people who are not part of the dominant structure. So, I mean, I don't think, I guess since we've been through the racism chapter, I think it's fair to say that, that in the United States, whiteness has been the unmarked category in which people basically were thought to have to enter in to be nationals and to be national citizens. But there are a lot of people who do not fit the dominant category who have very much embraced nationalism. And I don't want to say that the people who do that are somehow deluded or kind of or being dupes, because I think that that can be a genuine embrace and have some genuinely interesting effects. And so, you know, when people who are not necessarily part of the dominant category are embracing flags, going to war, doing nationalism things, you know, I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon. Probably has to do with the idea of hegemony, which we've talked about, which is accepting the conditions of, you know, even though you're not necessarily benefiting from them. But it's certainly a possibility for something that happens in the world. And then I guess, again, it's more, I'm not sure if it's, like I said, it's a quibble with guests, but what I was trying to say is that this sense of ethnic community, or the sense that you belong to a nation, at least historically, often emerges after this consolidation of a political unit or the consolidation of a state. And so, yes, in the case of the Kurds, they have never, they're trying to form, in some cases, an independent or autonomous government. But in most cases, the government has preceded, or the autonomous government has preceded that, creating that sense of ethnic community. So going back to the very first quote, we have made Italy, now we must make Italians. So I'm not entirely sure I'm going to argue against guests, but I just want to bring out some possible differences in how we might see nationalism. Now, like I said, that the idea of nationalism as creating one unitary ethnic identity comes to us as sort of a traditional idea from the 1990s, around the 1990s, I would say. Lots of different nations, especially in Latin America, but in other places as well, started to embrace something that we talked about in the last class, which is the idea of multiculturalism. Or people used to say that they were pluri meaning many, that they were a nation formed of many different cultures. And at least I put it in the caveat that at least in their sort of official proclamations, this doesn't mean that they all of a sudden had a big love for all the multicultural people, but they were sort of officially saying that they weren't trying to necessarily assimilate everyone. So a lot of people adopted, for example, language policies where they taught in an indigenous language in the schools for, you know, Quechua in Ecuador, for example. So they would do bilingual education instead of trying to make everyone speak necessarily the same language. And in some cases, you know, and I think I'm thinking maybe about Bolivia and to a certain extent, Ecuador, even to a certain extent, Canada, although that sounds weird. They would see themselves or officially declare themselves to be plurinational or multinational. And so when I say Canada, I'm thinking about some of the indigenous peoples there. Instead of saying that they're Native Americans, would say that they were First Nations. And this is the idea that, you know, they were nations before there was a Canada. And so if you want to talk about, you know, if their relationship to the Canadian nation state, well, then they need to negotiate with the First Nations. So like I said, this is not necessarily something that everybody embraced or got excited about, but some people really did think of themselves officially as that you could have a state which was multicultural or even or plurinational. I don't think they would say multinational because that means something else. I would say from about 2010 on, roughly, you know, and probably the backlash came about as soon as the multiculturalism came about, as we learned in the last class, and guests told us these tensions are always bubbling around. So the moment somebody says multicultural, somebody gets upset. But certainly in the last 10 years or so, there's been a very definite backlash, not just here, but in other places, to the idea that a country could or should be multicultural, that it could or should be plurinational, that it could or should welcome people from other places. And certainly, we talked about this in the last class, but there's been a surge of the idea of ethno-nationalism. And what this does is, when I was talking about that diffuse sense or amalgamated nationalism, there was kind of a combination of things and was probably, very much in line with whatever was the dominant or the majority view. And so that would be an unmarked nationalism. So, as we talked about in the United States, that whiteness was an unmarked category. Nobody talked about it because it was just seen as kind of the default or the majority category. And that nationalism in the United States was also unmarked, as it was just the default category. It's what you were supposed to do. And so, like I said, that didn't mean that the non-dominant groups couldn't embrace it. Many have, do, and did, and still do. But it was still assumed that you were kind of on the road to being something different than what you might have been if you were part of an ethnic minority or something that was in the non-dominant group. And when we have ethno-nationalism, it's when you take whatever that was and you just sort of, all of a sudden you call attention to it and you say, oh yeah, we are white nationalists. And it's like, oh, hi, yes, you are, good, welcome. So, an ethno-nationalism is when you explicitly link up an idea of race or of ethnicity, and you say, well, this is the way we're supposed to be nationalists, and any other form of nationalism or unless you're embracing our form of nationalism, you're not part of the nation. Guest ends this chapter with his thinking like an anthropologist section. For this one, I've added a question mark to it. And as he often does, he tells us at the end of this chapter, you should be better prepared with the anthropological tools to understand the ways ethnicity and nationalism work. And I hope that is true. And I hope that, a number of you kind of were going back and forth about this a little bit in the comments as, is nationalism good? Maybe nationalism is good. Or, well, I always thought nationalism was bad. And, some people were siding with the good and some people with the bad. And I guess I would say, well, there's not really a moral valence. It's not really in and of itself good or bad. Both ethnicity and nationalism there are powerful forms of identity and self-identification and how we identify with others. They don't have to be necessarily good or bad, but certainly they can be. They certainly can be linked to a very strange set of ideas which has had some pretty harsh effects on others in the world. So I wanted to change Guest's thing a little bit. That you should be ready, instead of just understanding, to diffuse the powder keg of ethnicity and nationalism. To say these are, right now, and probably for the last 20 or 30 years, these are some pretty dangerous ideas to wade into. As many of you know, those of you who drive the road to Utica, it's become an interesting time. And so one of the things I hope that we can hopefully do in anthropology is just learn how to de-escalate a little bit. People are getting into these ideas a little too much, maybe doing a little too much something with them. You want to not only understand how they work, but maybe understand how they were historically created so that you can kind of gently diffuse them, which I know is hard to do. So if you figure out a way to do it, I'd like to do it too. My own thinking on this is, Guest talks about we're giving you an anthropological toolkit, but you don't want to reach in and find a grenade in there and launch that out into the world. I used to assign a chapter in this class about clearing landmines in Rwanda, and thinking about how it's, a lot of the landmines in anthropology that you sometimes have to clear were the landmines that anthropologists put there before, and so you have to watch out that you don't trip the landmine that some other anthropologist put out for you. Since I don't read about landmines now, I'll call them grenades. You just have to watch out, because some of these things, like I said, especially ethnicity, anthropologists have kind of been involved in promoting at various points, and so you have to watch out you don't blow anything up when you pull that out of your toolbox. How we doing? Thunderstorm over? More warnings? Let's see. Severe weather statement was what I got. Okay, still have to watch out. What are we doing out there? Questions? Oh, I forgot to leave the chat on.